Salutations, fellow nerds. I'm Rick Y, the Wise Guy, and today is January 20th, 2025, and today is an incredibly important day for our nation's history that we remember the civil rights legend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So if you enjoy news, history, or humorous American hogwash, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. Sit a spell. Take your shoes off. Michael Luther King Jr. was born January 15th, 1929. It also happened to be the first year of the Academy Awards and the first year of the Great Depression and inauguration of Herbert Hoover. I hope that's not foreboding. He was named after his father would visit Germany in 1934, where he would find inspiration in the Protestant reformer Martin Luther. Returning to the United States, he changed both his own and his son's names. Martin Luther King Jr. would also follow his father and grandfather's footsteps when he became a co-pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Throughout his childhood, he would be educated in segregated schools, but found success against the backdrop of racial disparities in learning institutions. He graduated high school at 15 and then went on to earn his BA at Morehouse College in 1948 in sociology, which was foundational in helping him address the civil and social changes that were needed to end a segregated America. He then studied for 3 years at the theological school called Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania. Regardless of being in a predominantly white class, he was elected class president and earned a Bachelor of Divinity in 1951. It was here that he started getting really involved in theology, philosophy, and ethics, and studied the works of people like Gandhi and others, which shaped his philosophy toward nonviolent resistance. After having earned a fellowship at Crozer, he enrolled at Boston University, where he completed his residence and earned his doctorate in philosophy and systematic theology. Here, he would also meet his future wife, Coretta Scott. They fell in love, got married, and had 4 children. They then moved to Montgomery, Alabama in 1954, when he became a pastor at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. At this point, in his constant efforts throughout his life to work for civil rights, King was now a member of the Executive Committee for the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. In 1955, he was able to accept the leadership of the first great nonviolent demonstration for people of color, which was a 382-day bus boycott that resulted with the Supreme Court declaring that segregation of public buses was unconstitutional. Throughout the boycott, King's home was bombed. He had been arrested and subjected to hateful, bigoted behavior and words, as well as threats to his and his family's lives. He later became president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1957. In that role, he organized grassroots movement battling racial inequality and injustices. His work and devotion to civil rights grew into what was known as the Birmingham Campaign in 1963. This was an organized effort to desegregate public institutions, improve hiring practices for people of color, and address systematic racism in both housing and education. The strategies that were used were all nonviolent, such as sit-ins, marches, and other peaceful acts of civil resistance. As a result, the police commissioner, Bull O'Connor, released police canines as well as fire hoses on those who were practicing their constitutionally protected acts of expression. This also led to mass arrests. Participating in what is called good trouble, volunteers disobeyed local segregation laws that overwhelmed police departments. It was these arrests that the nation finally saw the brutality of police against Americans of color simply along racial lines. The outrage was intense across the states as images of the violence portrayed on televisions and reports were broadcast across radio stations. And among the arrested was Martin Luther King Jr. himself for having led the protests. Here he wrote the famous letter from Birmingham jail, where he criticizes his fellow clergy who tried to denigrate the civil rights movement. In the letter, he argued that people have a moral obligation to disobey unjust laws and create, quote, constructive tension to force societal change, while emphasizing the importance of nonviolence in the fight for civil rights. Inspiration points such as injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He also justified his direct nonviolence to address the incivilities that he saw as detrimental to many black Americans. He detailed the 4 steps of a nonviolent campaign. Nonviolent protest, including gathering facts, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action. He also made sure to highlight those moderate white Americans who valued order over justice while trying to appeal to fellow Christians along the lines of morals that they claimed to uphold dearly. Kind of sounds familiar. A few months after this letter was written and published, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. helped lead the March for Jobs and Freedom, where he delivered this now incredibly famous speech in front of 250,000 fellow Americans.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition. In a sense, we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check. When the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men, would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation. And so we've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until that is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hoped that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. And they have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone. And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our bodies, heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive. Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities, knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today. I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. This will be the day. This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. And so let freedom ring. From the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire, let freedom ring. From the mighty mountains of New York, let freedom ring. From the heightening Alleghanies of Pennsylvania, let freedom ring. From the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado, let freedom ring. From the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, and when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
I played the speech in its entirety due to its profound impact on civil rights and indeed my own upbringing and understanding of what is morally right and justifiable in this world. He was named Times Man of the Year in 1963. He earned honorary degrees, hung out with JFK, and campaigned for Lyndon B. Johnson. And he was arrested around 20 times defending the rights that he fought for. And in 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and he donated all of his money towards the civil rights movement at age 35, which made him the youngest recipient in the award's history. 4 years later, in 1968, he traveled to Memphis, Tennessee, where he was set to speak and lead a protest march for garbage workers in the city. The evening before the event, while standing on a balcony of his motel room, he was struck by a single bullet to the neck, severing his spinal cord and jugular. It was fired by a fugitive and a well-known racist by the name of James Earl Ray. This cataclysmic event caused the eruption of riots across the country and demonstrated the deep tensions that had been brewing for decades. Later that year, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of '68, or officially recognized as the Fair Housing Act, which prohibited the discrimination of people of color in housing. This was a policy that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. had been passionate about in his life. He was buried in Southview Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia, but later reinterred to the grounds of the Martin Luther King Jr. Center for Nonviolent Social Change, which had been established by his wife, Coretta Scott King, in 1968. In 2006, she too passed away and was subsequently buried alongside her husband. Although not linked to his assassination, the FBI had spent years harassing and trying to stop his efforts. Under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, the intelligence agencies of the United States had led a sustained campaign to discredit King. The FBI specifically monitored him extensively, from tapping his phones to bugging his hotels and even following him around. All of this was justified as national security concerns. They also organized public smear campaigns. They disseminated damaging information about him to the public in order to discredit his movement. One abhorrent letter to King from the FBI encouraged him to take his own life. After the assassination, the killer retracted his confession and claimed to have been a patsy in a broader conspiracy. All of this has fueled decades-long conspiracies. To this day, their involvement has even been cited by some in their own distrust towards government officials. Regardless of his untimely passing, the legacy left by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will forever be etched in the creation of the American experience. Through small acts of peace and nonviolence was he able to change the world in massive ways for millions of people. Indeed, to this day, we still fight civil and social injustice as we march to the beat of Martin Luther King Jr.'s drum. Forever, will he be a singular example of how individual Americans can make a big difference? If there's one thing that MLK did, it was bring attention to the inequalities we face in this nation and the need for reform even into this day. It wasn't simply the racial injustice and inequalities, but wealth and income disparities, as well as housing and labor reform. He recognized them and tried to speak up on the need for all of us to come together if we wish to see real changes in this world. And if there's one thing that the current powers want you to focus on, it's the ever-persistent mind-numbing of wedge issues that keep us all from achieving what we all rightly deserve. I know it was a long video, and if you've stayed this long, thanks for sticking in there with me. And I wish everyone a happy Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Y'all come back now. You hear?